In the heart of Montana, where the mountains whisper secrets and the town lives by strict rules, 25-year-old Elijah hides the truth about himself. His heart burns with forbidden feelings for Nathan, an older man who seems unattainable. But when secrets are revealed and the betrayal of his loved ones breaks his heart, can Elijah find the strength to be himself? A story of love, struggle, and hope that will change everything. The sun rose slowly over White River, Montana, painting the rugged peaks in hues of gold and amber. In this small town, nestled between mountains that stood like silent sentinels, life moved at a deliberate pace. The air carried the scent of pine and fresh earth, and the streets hummed with a quiet rhythm of routine. For Elijah Thompson, though, the beauty of the landscape couldn't mask the weight he carried inside. At 25, he felt like a stranger in his own hometown, a place where everyone knew your name, but not your heart. Elijah lived in a modest house at the edge of town, its weathered clapboard walls a testament to generations of Thompsons who'd called it home. His parents, Martha and Samuel, were pillars of the community, their lives anchored by faith and tradition. Sunday sermons, potluck dinners, and the unspoken expectation that Elijah would follow their path. Marriage, children, a steady job at the family store defined their world. But Elijah's world was different, a secret mosaic of thoughts and feelings he'd learned to hide. He'd known for years he was gay, a truth that crystallized in his teens but remained unspoken. In White River, where church bells rang louder than questions, such a truth was more than taboo. It was unthinkable. Elijah had seen what happened to those who strayed. Whispers in the pews, cold shoulders at the market, families fractured by shame. So he buried his secret, wearing a mask of compliance that grew heavier with each passing year. He smiled at the right moments, nodded when his father spoke of settling down, and prayed at night for a heart that matched the one his town demanded. The family store, Thompson's Goods, was Elijah's daily refuge and prison. He spent his mornings stocking shelves with canned peaches and flour sacks, the monotony a shield against his thoughts. Customers came and went, their chatter a backdrop to his silence. "You're a good boy, Elijah," Mrs. Harper said one morning, her wrinkled hands clutching a bag of apples. "Your folks must be proud." Elijah forced a smile, the words stinging like salt in a wound. Good, but not true. Not himself. It was at the store that Elijah first noticed Nathan Clark, the new history teacher who'd arrived in White River the previous fall. Nathan was 38, with a quiet strength that drew eyes without demanding attention. His dark hair was flecked with gray, and his hazel eyes held a warmth that seemed to see beyond surfaces. He'd stop by for coffee or a newspaper, always pausing to ask Elijah about the town or share a story from his travels. "Ever been to Seattle?" Nathan asked one day, leaning against the counter. "It's a place where people start over." Elijah shook his head, his pulse quickening. The idea of starting over felt like a dream he wasn't allowed to have. Nathan's visits became a rhythm Elijah craved. Their conversations were brief, but charged with an unspoken connection. Nathan spoke of books, ideas, places where the world stretched wider than White River's borders. Elijah listened, his guarded answers laced with a hunger he couldn't name. He caught himself watching Nathan's hands as he counted change, strong and steady, or the way his smile softened when their eyes met. Each encounter left Elijah unsteady, torn between hope and fear that Nathan might see the truth he hid. One afternoon, as summer heat pressed against the store's windows, Nathan lingered longer than usual. The shop was empty, the air thick with the hum of an old fan. "You ever feel like you're meant for something else?" Nathan asked, his voice low, almost conspiratorial. Elijah froze, a jar of honey clutched in his hands. The question felt like a key turning in a lock he'd bolted shut. "Sometimes," he admitted, barely above a whisper. Nathan's gaze held his, steady but gentle, as if he saw the weight Elijah carried. "You're not alone in that," Nathan said, and the words landed like a lifeline. That evening, Elijah walked home under a sky streaked with crimson, Nathan's words echoing in his mind. He passed the church, its steeple a stark silhouette against the dusk, and felt a pang of guilt. His parents' voices rang in his memory, scriptures about sin, warnings about straying from God's path. Yet Nathan's quiet assurance tugged at him, a promise that there was more to life than fear. At dinner, his mother chatted about the upcoming fair, But Elijah's thoughts were elsewhere, tangled in the possibility of a truth he might one day speak. As he lay in bed that night, the stars visible through his window, Elijah felt a shift within him. It wasn't courage, not yet, but a flicker of something new, a question that refused to stay buried. Who was he, really, beyond the expectations of White River? And why did Nathan's words make him believe, for the first time, that he might find out? The summer sun hung heavy over White River, Montana, its relentless heat seeping into every corner of the town. Elijah Thompson moved through his days at Thompson's Goods with a rhythm born of habit, but his thoughts were far from the shelves he stocked. Nathan Clark's words from weeks ago, "You're not alone in that," had taken root, sprouting questions Elijah wasn't sure he was ready to answer. Each time Nathan stopped by the store, their brief exchanges felt like sparks, fleeting but bright enough to unsettle the careful balance Elijah had maintained for years. The town was abuzz with preparations for the annual White River Fair, a tradition that drew everyone together under strings of lights and the promise of fried dough and laughter. Elijah's mother, Martha, was in her element, organizing the church bake sale with a fervor that left no room for doubt. "You'll help with the booth, won't you, Elijah?" she asked one evening, her voice warm but expectant. He nodded, the weight of her assumptions pressing against his chest. To her, he was the dutiful son, destined for a life that mirrored her own. To himself, he was a question mark, undefined and aching for clarity. Nathan, it turned out, had been roped into helping with the fair too. The school principal had tasked him with overseeing a community project, a restoration of the Old Town Library, a sagging building that hadn't seen a fresh coat of paint in decades. When Nathan mentioned it at the store, his eyes lit up with a quiet enthusiasm. "We could use an extra pair of hands," he said, glancing at Elijah. "You in?" The invitation was casual, but to Elijah, it felt like a door cracking open. "Sure," he replied, his voice steadier than he felt. The library project became their unlikely meeting ground. Afternoons found them side by side, sanding warped shelves and hauling boxes of dusty books. The work was grueling under the summer sun, but Elijah welcomed the ache in his muscles. It grounded him, kept his mind from spiraling. Nathan was a steady presence, his stories of far-off cities weaving a tapestry of possibility. "In Portland," he said one day, wiping sweat from his brow, "people live however they want. No one bats an eye." Elijah listened, his hands stilling on a paint roller. The idea of a place where he could breathe freely felt like a fairy tale, beautiful but distant. Their conversations deepened as the days passed. Nathan asked questions that cut through Elijah's defenses, about his dreams, his fears, the parts of himself he kept hidden. "You're quiet, but there's a lot going on in there," Nathan said once, tapping his temple with a grin. Elijah managed a shy smile, his heart racing. He wanted to tell Nathan everything, the truth he'd buried, the longing that kept him awake at night, but fear held him back. What if Nathan turned away? What if the town found out? One evening, as they worked late to finish a section of the library, the air grew thick with unspoken words. The sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the room bathed in the soft glow of a single bulb. Nathan set down his brush and looked at Elijah, his expression unreadable. "You ever feel like you're hiding from yourself?" he asked, his voice low. Elijah's breath caught, the question slicing through years of pretense. He wanted to lie, to deflect, but Nathan's gaze held him fast. "All the time," he admitted, the words slipping out before he could stop them. For a moment, neither spoke. The silence was heavy, charged with a truth Elijah couldn't retract. Nathan stepped closer, his presence steadying rather than overwhelming. "I've been there," he said softly. "Took me years to figure out who I was. But you don't have to do it alone." The words were a lifeline, simple yet profound. Elijah's eyes stung, and he looked away, afraid of what Nathan might see if he held his gaze too long. They didn't speak of it again that night, but something had shifted. As they packed up, Nathan clapped a hand on Elijah's shoulder, a gesture of camaraderie that felt like a promise. "You did good today," he said, his smile warm. Elijah nodded, his throat tight with emotions he couldn't name. Walking home under a star-streaked sky, he felt a flicker of courage, fragile but real. Nathan saw him, not the mask, not the son White River expected, but him. At home, the house was quiet, his parents already asleep. Elijah sat on the edge of his bed, the library's scent of paint and old books still clinging to his clothes. He thought of Nathan's words, of the world beyond White River, where people lived without fear. For the first time, he let himself imagine it, not as a fantasy, but as a possibility. The fair was days away, and with it, the eyes of the town. But in that moment, alone with his thoughts, Elijah felt a spark of defiance. He wasn't ready to speak his truth, not yet, but he was starting to believe he could. The White River Fair arrived like a burst of color against the muted greens and browns of Montana's late summer. Strings of lights twinkled above the town square, and the air carried the sweet tang of cotton candy and the clang of carnival games. For most of White River, it was a night of joy, a chance to gather and celebrate. For Elijah Thompson, it was a stage where every step felt like a performance, his secret a shadow trailing close behind. The fair was in full swing when Elijah arrived to help at the church's bake sale booth. His mother, Martha, bustled about, arranging pies and chatting with neighbors, her smile a beacon of community pride. "You're a blessing, Elijah," she said, handing him a tray of cookies to sell. He nodded, the words hollow against the truth he carried. At 25, he was still her good son, but the mask he wore was cracking, strained by the hours spent with Nathan Clark and the questions they'd stirred. Nathan was there too, overseeing a booth for the library project. Elijah caught glimpses of him through the crowd, his easy laughter and steady presence drawing people in. Their work together had become a quiet refuge, a space where Elijah felt seen without judgment. Nathan's words from the library, "You don't have to do it alone," echoed in his mind, a promise that both steadied and unsettled him. He wanted to believe it, but White River's rules were carved deep, and the fair's cheerful chaos only amplified his fear of being exposed. Elijah's best friend, David Harper, found him at the booth an hour into the evening. They'd grown up together, sharing secrets over fishing trips and late-night bonfires. David was broad-shouldered and quick to grin, his life neatly aligned with the town's expectations. A steady job, a fiancé, a future mapped out. "You're quiet tonight," David said, leaning against the booth. "Everything okay?" Elijah hesitated, the weight of his truth pressing against his ribs. He never told anyone, but Nathan's encouragement had loosened something inside him, a need to be known. "I've been thinking a lot," Elijah said, his voice low to avoid his mother's ears. "About who I am. I'm not like everyone else here." The words felt like stones dropping into still water, their ripples impossible to contain. David's brow furrowed, his grin fading. "What do you mean?" he asked, a note of unease creeping in. Elijah swallowed, his heart pounding. "I'm gay, David," he said, barely above a whisper. The confession hung between them, raw and unguarded. David's face changed, a mix of shock and something harder, disapproval, maybe fear. "That's not right, Elijah," he said, his voice tight. "You know what the Bible says. You can't just choose that." Elijah's stomach twisted, the rejection sharper than he'd braced for. "It's not a choice," he said, his voice trembling. "It's me." But David shook his head, stepping back as if Elijah's words were contagious. "You need to fix this," he muttered before turning away, disappearing into the crowd. The rest of the night passed in a blur. Elijah smiled for customers, handed out cookies, and nodded at his mother's instructions. But inside, he was unraveling. David's reaction had cracked open a fear he'd long buried, that his truth would cost him everything. When the fair wound down, he slipped away, needing air, needing space. He found himself by the river, its dark waters reflecting the stars. The memory of Nathan's words clashed with David's condemnation, leaving him stranded between hope and despair. The next morning, the fallout came swiftly. Elijah woke to his parents' voices downstairs, sharp and urgent. He descended to find them in the kitchen, their faces etched with anger and grief. David had told them everything, framing it as concern, a warning to save his friend. "Is it true?" Samuel, his father, demanded, his voice like gravel. Elijah's mouth went dry, but he couldn't lie. Not now. "Yes," he said, the word a release and a wound. Martha gasped, tears spilling down her cheeks. "You're our son," she said, "but this is a sin. You can't stay here unless you change." The ultimatum hit like a physical blow. Elijah stood frozen, the home he'd known his whole life turning hostile. "I can't change who I am," he said, his voice breaking. Samuel pointed to the door. "Then you need to go." With nothing but a backpack and the clothes on his back, Elijah left, The doors slam, echoing like a final judgment. He wandered to the edge of town, his mind a storm of hurt and betrayal. David's face flashed before him, the friend who'd chosen fear over loyalty. His parents' words stung deepest, their love conditional in a way he'd never imagined. Elijah thought of Nathan, the one person who'd seen him without judgment, but shame kept him from seeking him out. What if Nathan turned away too? The river stretched before him, its current steady despite his chaos. He sat on its bank, clutching his bag, and let the tears come, not for what he'd lost, but for the boy who'd hidden so long. The road out of White River stretched long and lonely, flanked by fields that shimmered under the late summer sun. Elijah Thompson walked it with a backpack slung over his shoulder, each step heavy with the weight of his family's rejection. At 25, he was unmoored, the town that had shaped him now a closed door. His parents' words, "You can't stay unless you change," rang in his ears, a verdict that cut deeper than he'd ever imagined. David's betrayal, spilling Elijah's secret to save him from himself, was a wound that refused to close. Yet beneath the hurt, a stubborn spark flickered, a resolve to find a place where he could stand tall. Elijah caught a bus to Missoula, the nearest city, its skyline a jarring contrast to White River's quiet hills. The streets buzzed with strangers, their indifference both daunting and freeing. He found a cheap motel, its neon sign flickering like his own uncertainty, and spent his first night staring at the ceiling, grappling with a question that loomed larger than ever. Who was he without the expectations that had defined him? The answer felt distant, but for the first time, he had the space to search for it. Money was tight, his savings from his store barely enough to cover a week. Elijah took to wandering Missoula's streets, passing coffee shops and bookstores that felt like glimpses of another life. One afternoon, drawn by a rainbow flag in a window, he stepped into a community center tucked between a deli and a laundromat. The space was warm, cluttered with flyers and mismatched chairs. A woman greeted him, her silver hair pulled into a loose bun. "I'm Clara," she said, her smile kind but searching. "You look like you could use a friend." Clara ran a support group for people like Elijah, those navigating identities that didn't fit neatly into the world's boxes. Hesitant at first, he joined a meeting, sitting silently as others shared stories of rejection, resilience, and hard-won peace. Their voices cracked open something in him, a recognition that his pain wasn't singular. "I didn't think I'd ever belong anywhere," a young man named Riley said, his eyes bright with defiance. "But here I'm enough." Elijah listened, his throat tight, and when it was his turn, he spoke haltingly of White River, of David's betrayal, of the family that turned him away. The group held his words without judgment, and for the first time, he felt seen, not as a sin or a secret, but as himself. Clara became a guide, her wisdom tempered by her own scars. "You're not broken, Elijah," she told him one day over coffee, her voice steady. "The world's got its rules, but you get to decide what makes you whole." She helped him find a job at a local diner, washing dishes in a steamy kitchen that smelled of grease and possibility. The work was grueling, but it gave him structure, a foothold in a city that was starting to feel less foreign. At night, he'd sit in his motel room, sketching in a notebook, landscapes from memory, jagged mountains and quiet rivers, as if drawing White River could help him reclaim it on his own terms. Yet the past wasn't done with him. One evening, as rain pattered against the motel window, Elijah found a letter slipped under his door. The handwriting was Nathan's, precise and familiar. "Elijah," it began, "I heard what happened. I should have been there for you, and I wasn't. Can we talk?" The words stirred a storm of emotions. Anger at Nathan's silence, longing for the connection they'd built, and a flicker of hope that refused to die. Elijah sat with the letter for hours, tracing its lines. Clara's advice echoed. Healing starts with facing what hurt you. He knew he'd have to return to White River, if only to close the chapter that had left him raw. Missoula's support group gave him tools to rebuild. Riley invited him to art nights, where they painted murals and laughed over spilled acrylics. A woman named June shared her story of reconciling with her sister, offering Elijah a glimpse of what forgiveness might look like. Slowly, he began to see himself not as a castaway, but as someone with a future worth shaping. "You're stronger than you know," Clara said one day, watching him help a new group member settle in. Elijah wanted to believe her, but the thought of facing Nathan and the town tested that strength. By late September, Elijah had saved enough for a bus ticket back. The decision wasn't easy. Missoula felt safe, a cocoon where he could grow. But White River held pieces of him he couldn't leave behind. Not yet. He packed his bag, the letter folded carefully inside, and boarded the bus. As the city faded into fields, he thought of the river back home, its steady current a mirror to the resilience he was starting to claim. Whatever waited in White River, he'd face it not as the boy who'd left, but as a man learning to stand in his truth. The bus rumbled back into White River, Montana, under a sky bruised with clouds, the familiar peaks looming like old ghosts. Elijah Thompson gripped his backpack, the weight of Nathan's letter a quiet pulse in his pocket. Missoula had given him a glimpse of freedom, a community that held him without judgment, but returning to the town that had cast him out felt like stepping onto a tightrope. At 25, he wasn't the same boy who'd left, broken, betrayed, but he wasn't whole yet either. This trip was about finding closure, about proving to himself he could face the past and walk away stronger. White River looked unchanged. The church steeple piercing the dusk, the general store's faded sign creaking in the wind. Elijah's chest tightened as he passed his family's house, its windows dark, a silent reminder of the door that had slammed behind him. He didn't stop. His destination was the library, where Nathan had asked to meet. The building stood prouder now, its fresh paint and new shells a testament to their shared work. Inside, the air smelled of wood polish and possibility, a stark contrast to the storm brewing in Elijah's heart. Nathan was there, arranging books near the history section. He looked up as Elijah entered, his hazel eyes catching the light, a mix of relief and caution in his expression. "You came," Nathan said, setting a book down. Elijah nodded, his throat tight. "I needed to." They stood for a moment, the silence heavy with everything unspoken. Elijah's confession to David, the betrayal that followed, the family that turned him away. Nathan hadn't been there when it mattered, and that absence stung as much as the rest. They sat at a table, the library empty save for the hum of a distant heater. "I heard what happened," Nathan began, his voice low. "With your friend, your parents. I should have checked on you, Elijah. I am sorry." The apology was sincere, but it didn't erase the ache. "Why didn't you?" Elijah asked, his words sharper than he intended. Nathan looked down, his hands clasped. "I was afraid. This town, it's not kind to people who step out of line. I thought keeping my distance would protect you." Elijah's jaw tightened. It didn't. The truth spilled out then, raw but steady. Elijah spoke of the pain, David's rejection, his parents' ultimatum, the loneliness of those first nights in Missoula. But he also spoke of Clara, Riley, the group that had become his anchor, teaching him he wasn't a mistake. Nathan listened, his face etched with regret. "You're stronger than I was at your age," he said finally. "I stayed quiet too long, hid who I was to fit in. I see you doing better than that, and it's humbling." Elijah wanted to ask what Nathan meant. Had he hidden his own truth? But the question felt too heavy. Instead, he pulled out the letter, its edges worn from rereading. "This brought me back," he said, "but I'm not here to fix things. I needed to see this place again, to know I can leave it behind." Nathan's eyes softened. "You're already more than this town, Elijah. You've got a light in you. Don't let anyone dim it." The conversation wasn't a resolution, but it was enough. Elijah felt a weight lift, not from forgiveness, but from clarity. He didn't need Nathan's approval or White River's to be himself. As they parted, Nathan offered a small nod. "If you ever need me, I'm here," he said. Elijah returned the nod, knowing he likely wouldn't call, but grateful for the offer. Outside, the town was settling into evening, porch lights flickering on. Elijah walked to the river, its familiar current a mirror to the steadiness he'd found within. He thought of Clara's words, "You decide what makes you whole." For too long, he let White River define him, its rules, its judgment. Now he saw a path forward, not fully formed, but his to shape. A voice broke his thoughts, David, standing a few yards away, his face uncertain. "Elijah," he said, stepping closer. I messed up. I thought I was helping, telling your folks. I'm sorry." The words were raw, and Elijah saw the guilt in his friend's eyes. Part of him wanted to lash out, to make David feel the hurt he'd caused. But Missoula had taught him something about grace, about choosing his own peace. "I hear you," Elijah said, his voice even. But I can't pretend it didn't happen. I need time. David nodded, his shoulders slumping, and walked away. Elijah stayed by the river until the stars emerged, their light a quiet promise. He wasn't staying in White River, Missoula called, with its community, its possibilities, but he'd carry this moment with him. The strength to return, to speak, to let go. As he boarded the bus the next morning, the mountains fading behind him, Elijah felt a new kind of freedom. Not the absence of pain, but the courage to live beyond it, to build a life where he was enough.